Hi, fantasy readers. This is Corinne Norton, your fellow bookbinger, and you are listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, where you can test out a new fantasy story every single week to find your next favorite author. Today's story has a unique world with morally gray characters and the lessons they learn. It's written by Amanda Auler, author of the Mothmar trilogy. As an advocate for stories steeped in theme, it's no wonder some of her favorite authors are Patrick Rothfuss, Brandon Sanderson, and Juliette Marillier, whose books I also love, but whose name I have no idea how to pronounce. When Amanda's not at her laptop, she can be found making cookies, baking bread, and trying to keep up with her 4 growing boys. She and her husband live in central North Carolina, where they stay up too late watching anime and eating fancy ramen. Today's narrator is Paeter Frandsen, host of Christian Geek Central. Stick around to the end or check out today's show notes to see where you can find more from both the author and the narrator. For now, please enjoy Of Prophecies and Pools by Amanda Auler.
Gunnar, priest of Temple Rin, hissed and pulled away from his too-hot tea. Shuffling around his small cottage, he made his way to the window, unlatched the shutter, and swung it wide to welcome the morning mist. Extending his arm through the window, he moved his mug in slow circles, watching the air snatch the steam that rose from the mug hewn by his own hand. The morning was cool now, but the height of summer was upon them, even this far north in Mothmar. Pre-dawn was the only time suitable for walking, in Gunnar's opinion. Orny chirruped from the floor. Gunnar's eyes swung to meet his iguana's beady ones. They blinked at each other. "I suppose you can accompany me on my walk today," Gunnar said with a sigh and crouched low, his knees letting out a satisfying pop. The moss-green iguana scrambled up Gunnar's robed arm and settled behind his neck, his tail sweeping lazily across Gunnar's shoulders and down over his chest. "No tail in my tea, please," he requested of Torny, who purred in response. "Your tea, Gunnar scratched beneath the creature's chin. "You're a little menace, Torny." Then they were off, out the door and down the large stone pathway until leather-shod feet met a dust-crusted path. He would walk the perimeter of Enderin, keeping south and then west of the city, as was his way. The towering mountains that cupped the city on all sides would keep him cool until his return journey. Gunnar made his way over the grounds, greeting those who rose early to complete their chores before the sun ruled the skies. Though the adults gave him conciliatory nods, the children scrambled to his sides, hands grasping and lips whispering to the lizard balanced on his shoulders. He chuckled to himself as Torny ignored them, chin held high in the air, eyes closed. "Torny doesn't seem to be in the mood today, children," he said gently. A few of the children slowed and turned away, but one boy kept stride with Gunnar. He held a small yellow fruit in his hand. "I brought Torny breakfast." Slowing to a stop, Gunnar turned to the boy and gave Torny a sideways glance over his shoulder. One eye peeked open, Torny's tongue extended for a moment before disappearing behind his reptilian lips. "Well, come then," Gunnar nodded to the boy. The boy raised his offering to the iguana, who ignored it only a moment before all willpower dissolved. The boy squealed as Torny snatched it from him, chomping happily on the soft flesh of the fruit. "He likes it." "Indeed." Gunnar's lips turned downward as he watched juice dribble from Torny's chin onto his robes. "Say thank you, Torny." Torny chirped. Leaving the clambering children in his wake, Gunnar threaded through the heavy mists, taking quick sips of his tea along the way. Enderin's whitewashed stone buildings loomed amidst the dawn blue like giants awaiting discovery. They were only overshadowed by Mount Enderin, the mother giant calling her children back home to natural rock. She was unseen as of yet, though it would not be long. The city was beginning to wake. The sounds of the smithy, the smells of the bakery, and the silhouettes of the townspeople made themselves known. Halfway up the hill, sweat beginning to bead on his lower back, Gunnar stopped, his ears trained toward the mountain. The cries of a murder of crows breached the morning air, bothered, no doubt, by something coming down the mountain. He squinted past the white walls and the rooftops of homes just as the sun burst through two slivers of rock, highlighting the very place he sought. A boy, no, not just a boy, a scribe made his way down the impassable mountain. He was doing a sort of run, tumble, run as he skittered over rocks, hair flying with wild abandon behind him. Gunnar grinned. "Why, Torny," he whispered to the lizard draped across his shoulders. "A prophecy is afoot." He brought his mug across to his left shoulder, and Torny lapped at the liquid inside. Gunnar took another sip and scrunched his nose before dumping the remaining contents on the ground beside him. If he hurried, he could meet the boy before he was swarmed by the villagers, eager for a word from the Celestials as they were. He hung his mug delicately from a small branch of a nearby tree and diverted from the path, grasping the front of his robes as he went. Had it really been 37 years since his own descent from that mountain? He remembered it clearly. As a scribe, he was to lie awake all night awaiting his seer's prophecy, for a prophecy only came when the mother of the night, the moon, was high in the sky. Gunnar had spent that fateful day catching critters in the sun when he should have been sleeping. Guilt creeped up, a snaking tendril around his throat as he thought of that final day. He had fallen asleep while on duty, and Seer Oswald had prophesied. Gunnar had awoken to the dronings of his seer and had frantically attempted to rectify his mistake, only to spill tea all over his scroll. Doing the best a 12-year-old could, Gunnar had embellished, crafted, and produced a prophecy that, to this day, he still had no way of knowing if it would ever come to pass. He could see the wooden gate that hemmed in the northern perimeter. A simple latch kept the goats from wandering too far from the shepherds of Enderin, of which there were several. Goats and ore kept Enderin's roads clean and people fed. Hand on the bolt, Gunnar jumped as something thumped against the opposite side of the door. He unlatched the gate and swung it open to find a boy with chin-length hair the color of sand under a summer sun. The boy righted himself, dusting his pants as he turned to face Gunnar. "Are you quite all right?" Gunnar asked. Torny hissed. The boy jumped, eyes on Torny. "What is that thing?" "You scared him," Gunnar said to Torny. Torny chirped instead. "Much better," the priest said before shifting his eyes to the boy once more. "Welcome back to the base of the mountain, young scribe. You have a prophecy for us?" The boy, still warily eyeing the iguana on Gunnar's shoulders, pulled his hair back into a knot before sliding a scroll from the waistband of his pants. It had been rolled too tightly, a dent in the middle creating a sharp V. Gunnar suppressed a wince as the parchment cracked and rolled in the boy's grip. He grit his teeth to keep from lurching forward and snatching the scroll outright. "Will it bite me?" the boy asked, eyes still on Torny. "Heavens, boy, you just descended one of the most dangerous mountains in Mothmar, and you're worried about an iguana? What is your name?" "Bardock," the boy said, straightening his shoulders and taking a tentative step toward Gunnar. "Are you the priest?" "What gave it away, my robes or the lizard?" Gunnar grinned. Bardock blinked at him. Rolling his eyes, Gunnar said, "Yes, I'm Priest Gunnar." "Oh, right." Bardock's eyes shifted to the scroll and back to Gunnar. His arm lowered a fraction, the scroll extending toward the priest. Gunnar held out a hand for the holy text. Bardock looked away and his brow furrowed. His hand on the scroll tightened. Gunnar reached for the parchment as Bardock lifted it away, the priest of Temple Rin grasping empty air. The boy stammered, rubbing the back of his neck with the rolled paper. "Aren't I supposed to go to the serviceers at the temple? I didn't know you would greet me here." "That," Gunnar held up a finger, "was a happy accident." He chuckled to himself and scratched Torny's chin. "But there's no such thing, is there? You arrived in an important season, young Bardock. Very important indeed. Bardock blanched. Why is that? We are expecting a visitor today. Gunnar cocked his head toward Torny. I tried to put him off, but apparently he ignored my letters. He shifted his gaze back to the boy, whose eyes flicked from priest to lizard and back again. Go ahead and hand that over, Doc. Can I call you Doc? Bardock mumbled. Sure? Gunnar opened his palm to the boy. The prophecy, if you don't mind. Bardock hesitated only a moment more before pulling it from behind his back and placing it in Gunnar's hand. I just have to— Follow me, Gunnar interrupted as he turned. Tucking the scroll within a cavernous sleeve, he began marching back down the hill. As I said, Doc, it's an important day and we have little time to loaf about. Without looking back, Gunnar strode to his familiar dusty path. The mists thinned as the sun climbed heavenward, evaporating even as Gunnar's robes broke through. The birds began to sing their trills and melodies, and Gunnar couldn't help the grin that lit his face as the sun's rays suffused his body. The priest didn't have to worry about his new companion as Bardock clomped behind him. Gunnar slowed and peered over his shoulder. Move your big head, Torny, he said to his lizard. Torny flicked his tongue, crouched, and, before Gunnar could stop him, sprang from his perch. All four of his limbs sprawled like a starfish as he flopped to the ground. Torny! Gunnar gasped and rubbed at his shoulder, smarting from Torny's claws. It's not that big. I was just teasing. But with unexpected speed, Torny tore off into the brush, his scaly tail the last thing to be seen before he fully disappeared. Are you okay? Gah! Gunnar jumped and glared at the boy, who was standing a mere handspan from him. Yes, Gunnar said. He does this all the time. Though he didn't. Oh, Bardock said as he squinted past Gunnar. Was he frightened by the goats? Gunnar turned to find a sea of mountain goats barring their path. At their center rose a crook, bells tinkling at the top. A voice came from amid the braying expanse. Who blocks my path? Your eyes be upward, Tanol, Gunnar called, and then quickly turned to Bardock with a whisper. Say nothing of who you are. Bardock blinked in surprise. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. And be filled with light. The shepherd emerged from his flock. Small in stature, quick in tongue, Tanol smiled at Gunnar, the bulk of his bushy beard shifting. How was your walk this morning, Priest Gunnar? Delightful, though give the sun another hour and we'll all be wading through soup. Tanol chuckled, and the bells tied to the top of his crook tinkled. Well, I never much liked my soup cold. It's the height of summer. Perhaps we should go for a dip in Celestial's pool. The shepherd pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped at his forehead. Celestial's pool? Bardock asked, taking a step toward the men. Gunnar turned toward him and gave a slight shake of the head. You haven't been? Tanol asked. At the center point of two peaks there forms a few natural swimming holes. His eyes narrowed on the boy. I'm surprised a boy of your age doesn't know of it. What's your name? Bardock, the boy said with a look of defiance in his eyes. And I wouldn't know because I've been stuck upon that mountain for the last 9 years. Gunnar pinched his nose and gave a long and exaggerated sigh. Doc. I didn't say I was a scribe, Bardock said with a shrug. A scribe! Tanol's face went a shade of white beneath his beard as he skittered backward and fell to his knees. His herd immediately milled about him. Most Holy One, and now summer! Enveloped by his cloud of goats, one hand clutched the crook and the other burst from the drove of animals, palm to the sky. Tanol began to sing. Noel? Gunnar cleared his throat. By the light, get up before you draw a crowd. A head peeked between horns. Gunnar, is this not, in and of itself, fulfilling the— We still have the latter half of the season, Gunnar interrupted. He may not be the one. Though he couldn't squash the hope rising in his own chest, he wagged a finger at Tenol. Mind that tongue of yours. Rumors are a maiden's currency, and you wear no skirt. My lips are sealed, Tenol said, though the grin hidden beneath his beard said otherwise. Gunnar rolled his eyes. Let's go, Doc. And with a swish of robes around ankles, Gunnar turned from the shepherd and almost ran back to his cottage at the bottom of the hill. Dust kicked up behind him, and Bardock coughed in his wake, the two reaching the small cottage on the outskirts of South Enderin. Gunnar was diverting from tradition, yes, but there was no rule that compelled the scribe to go directly to the serviceers. He was the priest, after all. Examining the scroll first was a precaution. The serviceers would herald his wisdom, surely. Shoving his door open, he ushered the boy inside. In lieu of any thanks, Bardock let out a short ack, hitting his head on a cage hanging from the rafters. The bird inside squawked. "Watch yourself," Gunnar said as he peeked inside the cage. "Her eggs only just hatched." "Watch myself?" Bardock's eyes grew wide as he surveyed the small cabin littered with cages. "What is this place?" "My home." Gunnar bustled to the hearth and set to making a fire. "You will please respect the creatures. It is just as much their home as mine. Tea?" "It's getting a bit hot for tea." "Nonsense," Gunnar said, sprinkling loose leaves into the pot. "Have a seat, Doc. We will read the prophecy together." Eyes on his work, Gunnar only heard the crack of the door opening. He released a short whistle as he turned, and his osprey, Margaret, shot like an arrow to a perch at the front door. She eyed the boy, whose hand was on the door, and gave a bright cuck-cuck. Bardock turned around slowly, sweat glistening on his brow. "Boy," Gunnar soothed, pulling the scroll from his sleeve. "Where is it you plan to go?" The scribe licked his lips, hand still on the handle of the door, eyes shifting to the osprey too close to his face. "I think I should go to the serviceers. That's what I was trained to do." "I understand," Gunnar said as he sat at the table and motioned for Bardock to do the same. "But please believe me when I tell you, going out there is the last thing you want to do." "Why is that?" "Tenol is no secret keeper," Gunnar said with a chuckle. "You will be swarmed. You see, your prophecy has been long awaited." Gunnar motioned again to the seat with a nod, and Bardock finally complied, closing the door and sitting across from the priest in the small and cozy room. "Almost 10 years ago, a scribe came down that mountain with a scroll that held this very year in its scrawl. At the height of summer, year of the Hjorter, a holy one will perish at the holy mountain. However," Gunnar held up a finger, his breathing growing faster at the thought of what he held in his hand. "It then stated that the prophecy to follow, the one that would come in the same season and year, would provide salvation for the Holy One." His eyes sparkled. "Their death would never need to occur." Bardock gaped openly at Gunnar. "You're saying that my prophecy holds the key to saving a man's life?" "Indeed," Gunnar nodded sagely. "We expect High Priest Lars any day now, and I fear he is the Holy One of which the prophecy speaks." He held up the scroll with a grin. "But all will be well, as we may just have the answer here." Face paling, Bardock attempted to snatch the scroll back from the priest. "Oh, stop it, Bardock. Don't be nervous." Gunnar gave him a placating smile and a pat on the hand. "Wait, Priest Gunnar, Gunnar unrolled the scroll. Silence fell between the scribe and the priest. Gunnar blinked. The parchment was empty. Lights above. The boy had lied. Gunnar's eyes slowly came up to meet the boy's. "What have you done?" Bardock chewed his lip. "Boy." Gunnar's stomach turned as he flipped the parchment over and back, looking for something that wasn't there. "Tell me this is a joke." "It wasn't my fault," the boy whispered. "My seer died." The fire popped, and the water in the kettle began a soft boil. Yes, that's what seers do, Gunnar pointedly said. They proclaim their prophecy, and the soul leaves with their gift, and you write it down. No, Bardock shook his head. You don't understand. I woke up to begin my shift, and I found him. He was already gone. It was not quite dusk. Gunnar stood as still as Celestial's pool at dawn, not a single ripple. And what was your plan, handing me a blank scroll? Why not confess straight away? The boy bit at his lip. I was going to go straight to the temple. I thought... The boy trailed off, a blush creeping up and staining his cheeks pink. I thought maybe I could switch it out with another prophecy, maybe one that had been forgotten about long ago. He shook his head, his fists squeezing atop the table. It was a dumb idea, I know, but almost a decade on that God's-forsaken mountain, only to be sent back to start again? To wait on a new seer to deliver a new prophecy? The boy shook his head with vehemence, and his hair came loose from its rope, a curtain falling between him and Gunnar. I don't know what to do. Please don't send me back. Bardock began to cry. Gunnar reached forward to give the boy's hand another pat when a knock sounded at the door. Bardock stilled. Hide in the back room. The boy brooked no argument and scrambled through the doorway. Taking a moment to straighten his robes, Gunnar took a deep breath. He glanced at Margaret, who still sat by the door. What am I doing, Margie? Cuck, Margaret said. I know, he answered the osprey, but people are more important than tradition. He stepped to the door and pulled it inward. A group of 3 serviceers stood before him, and about 20 villagers behind them, all of them surrounded by goats. Gunnar peered around the serviceers to find Tenol cowering behind his shepherd's crook. The priest stepped out onto his stoop with his hands enclosed in his sleeves, the parchment tucked within. Good morning, Serviceer Wilma, he said with a bow to the first. Serviceer Taliana? A bow. Serviceer Barda. He held the last bow and peered up as sweat dripped into his left eye. It closed of its own accord, causing him to wink. Barda blushed and gave a small wave. Your eyes be upward, Priest Gunnar, they chimed, bowing in unison. And be filled with light, Gunnar replied appropriately. We have received news that a scribe descended Mount Enderin, said Serviceer Wilma, the tallest of the 3. As scribes are instructed to come directly to the temple, we were surprised to hear that you had taken it upon yourself to welcome him. Although we appreciate your willingness to help, Priest Gunnar, we do request he come back with us now. We are most anxious to hear the prophecy. Gunnar closed his eyes to the mid-morning sun and nodded with what he hoped seemed to be a quiet reverence. In truth, his mind was whirling. It was my pleasure, of course. I was on my morning walk when I found him descending. I only thought it right to greet him myself. Ah, yes, of course, Priest Gunnar, said Serviceer Barda with another quick bow. Wilma cleared her throat. Though we thank you for your show of hospitality, she continued, we do request that you return to tradition and release him to us. He could not allow them to have Bardock, not yet. Yes, he had only just met the boy, but he felt a certain kinship to him. Gunnar, too, had come across an impossible situation long ago. It was no fault of Bardock's that, though the boy was at least 3 years older than Gunnar had been, he couldn't quite think on his feet as Gunnar had. The only solution at present would be to do what Gunnar seemed to do best. Guilt twisted his gut. He would lie. He's sick, Gunnar said easily. Sick? Serviceer Wilma's forehead bunched, pulling the cap on her head down. What kind of sickness? Lips turned down in a frown, head shaking, Gunnar said, Both ends, I'm afraid. He's been in my outhouse all morning. Like the mountain mists clearing, all polite smiles were lost on the women's faces. Serviceer Taliana listed slightly to the right, trying to peek around Gunnar's abode to the stout wooden outhouse behind it. Serviceer Wilma took a deep breath before saying, "Well, perhaps we can make an—" But her words were cut off by a skittering sound across the path. All three women turned, but Gunnar only grinned and crouched low to the ground. Squealing and scattering, the women parted the way for Torny as his claws slapped the dust-covered ground. His tail wagged out behind him like an overlong rudder as he continued to run until he used Gunnar's arm as a ramp up to his shoulders. "Well, ladies," Gunnar said as he stood up once more, "always a pleasure." Straightening their hats and robes, they turned to leave. "I hope he's well enough by high sun to attend the reading at Temple Rin," Serviceer Barda said over her shoulder. "It would be a shame for him to relinquish the reading of his prophecy to another." "Whatever the Celestials will, so it will be." Gunnar bowed from his stoop. Taking a backward step, he shut the door slowly, sliding back inside his too-small hut, which had never felt too small before. He let out a shaky breath, still facing the door, his hand pressed on the wood. What would he do? Guilt reared up on its hind legs and rammed his heart like one of Tanol's goats. Was he destined to be a man of deception? When he had come down the mountain, a mere 12-year-old with dreams of a bright future, his deepest desire was to be known, to have a place amongst his people. Gunnar, surrounded by his creatures hanging from cages and a lizard around his neck, realized he had accomplished something quite a bit different than his younger self had imagined, for here he was, trapped on the same mountain with his creatures, his duties, and his lies. "Priest Gunnar?" Gunnar turned to find Bardock at the table, mug in hand, his face a portrait of nerves. "May I show you something?" he asked the boy. Bardock blinked. Shuffling to the dresser in his room, Gunnar opened the top drawer, removing the false bottom to retrieve a cracked and aged scroll. The hand that held it shook slightly, and he steadied himself with a breath. "Doc," Gunnar began. He cleared his throat. "I'm 49 now. It's been a long time since I came down that mountain." He sat across from the boy, and Torny slid from shoulders to floor. Only then did Gunnar notice how the boy's hands shook. "But I remember that feeling of panic like it was yesterday." Bardock's eyes met Gunnar's, a mix of fear, hope, and doubt swirling within twin green pools. "This was my prophecy." Heart pounding in his ears, Gunnar unrolled the scroll he had sworn he would never show another soul. With every fissure and crack, a jolt of lightning snaked through his body, threatening to undo him, threatening to change his mind. But something about this moment felt important. This boy needed to know he wasn't alone. Bardock's eyes widened for a moment, and then narrowed as Gunnar passed it to him. "What you're seeing is the panic of a boy without guidance, the mistake of a young man never rectified. What you're seeing here is the makings of—" he licked his lips, "a false prophecy." Eyes ravenous, the boy sat up straighter as he read the entire thing. Sweat beaded at the base of Gunnar's back, knowing he had just given his deepest secret to this newcomer he hardly knew. But in some ways, he and this boy shared more than anyone else within this mountain town. Both living sacrifices for a higher goal, two childhoods without human affection or communication for exorbitant amounts of time. "We will work this out, Doc." Gunnar reached across to pat the boy's hand, but before he could make contact, the boy stood, scroll still held in his hand. Gunnar also stood, terrified for a moment that Bardock would run and tell the serviceers. Would that be so bad? It had been a relief to show someone, anyone, his mistake, his lie. Perhaps they would let him keep the cottage, be a keeper of creatures. They were much easier to shepherd than people. Gunnar lowered his eyes and relaxed his shoulders. "If your conscience compels you to turn me in, Bardock took one step forward and hugged him. Stunned into silence, Gunnar stood still as a tree trunk, stable and sure. Bardock's shoulders shook. Gunnar could feel the boy's tears seep through his robes. He hugged him back. "You are safe here, Doc. We will solve this together." It wasn't the first time Gunnar had concocted a prophecy out of thin air. The first time, he had a bit more to go off of. Regardless, he paced the room, building words from nothing and allowing Bardock to construct the pieces onto the parchment before him. Soon, they had what Gunnar felt was just specific enough to be believable, and just vague enough to allow room for interpretation, which he would supply, of course. Bardock poked at the fire, the vestiges of their rewriting burning in the embers. Gunnar straightened the fresh robes he had donned and nodded to the boy, who stood and hit his head on a cage hung from the rafters. "Ready?" Gunnar asked. Bardock nodded. "Ready." Torny purred from the floor. Bardock gave him a pat. Gunnar grinned. They emerged from the cottage to a high and sweltering sun, all coolness of the morning long gone. "Walk with purpose, do not rush," Gunnar instructed, his eyes forward, his feet sure along the dirt path. "We are priests of Temple Rin." "I am?" "Well, you're a novice, but for all intents and purposes, the people will see you as holy." "Oh." "Now, listen twice as fast as you walk," Gunnar said, as he kept a steady march. "The prophecy ceremony will honor you and your seer's words. Be silent. When I call for you to read the scroll, you will step forward and read it clearly. When you are finished, you will roll it back up, hand it to the serviceer, and return to your place next to me." "What happens then?" the boy asked with labored breath. "I do not know. The content in each prophecy dictates the reaction of the people, but you must not speak." Gunnar continued with a glance back at Bardock. "I will provide the interpretation we discussed. We aren't looking to change history. We need only to give enough of a solution so the people don't come for blood." Bardock halted. "Blood?" "It's a figure of speech," Gunnar said with a wave of his hand in the air before tucking it back into his sleeves as they entered the city proper. Enderin was abuzz. Gunnar usually wound his way through the city once a week on his way to speak at Temple Rin. He preferred to keep to the sidelines, level with the people, but a prophecy ceremony was an entirely different occasion. Measured and stately, Gunnar cut through the throng, Bardock shuffling behind in his wake. The people, dressed in a range of formality, some in their work clothes, others having donned their best smocks, closed in behind the two like water, pushing them wordlessly toward the temple. The courtyard, usually layered with the sounds of livestock and negotiations, now held only reverent silence, anticipation. By the time they reached the steps of Temple Rin, its towering columns and shimmering white walls looming in the sunlight, it seemed the entire city milled behind them like church mice awaiting crumbs from the table. The grand double doors, plated in golden filigree, opened of their own accord. Unseen serviceers doing their part of the ceremony, fulfilling their roles as servants of the temple. Gunnar entered smoothly, trusting Bardock was behind him, mirroring his pace and demeanor. They reached the dais and turned, presenting themselves as stoic harbingers. The pews of the high-ceilinged room filled quickly, and only when the townspeople were tightly packed did talk and chatter fill the room, sounds bouncing and echoing against walls of stone. Gunnar glanced at Bardock, whose temples shone with sweat, his eyes feverishly scanning the people. Gunnar caught his gaze and saw the panic that lay within. He squinted, giving the boy a quiet smile. Bardock nodded slightly in return, his face softening and his lips releasing a slow breath. With an upward swing of his arms to the ceiling, Gunnar quieted the people. "People of Enderin, your eyes be upward." "And be filled with light," the people responded as one. "Walking between the mists this morning, I was given a true grace from above. A scribe has come down from the mountain, prophecy in hand, a word from the celestials themselves. We have all been waiting for such a word to come, as was foretold some time ago. Whether it be this scribe or another yet to come, I am pleased to introduce to you Bardock, novice of Temple Rin." As Bardock came to step beside Gunnar, the doors of the temple broke open again. A beam of sunlight shone across the threshold, illuminating a small man marching into the space. All heads turned, like a rippling wave across the room. "High Priest Lars!" Gunnar blurted, only barely keeping his hand from slapping over his lips. "Welcome to Enderin," he amended the cordiality in his tone, even as everything in Gunnar squirmed with unease. He had hoped the man had hearkened Gunnar's messages and delayed his trip, or at the very least, arrived after the ceremony that was about to occur. Serviceer Taliana and Serviceer Barda skittered to either side of the aged man. They hemmed him in, walking with stately grace beside the small priest, who took several tiny steps until he was standing next to Gunnar. The high priest, robed in brown, wore a hat half his height, the tassels at its top swinging as he gave a quick bow to match Gunnar's dip toward the floor before turning to the people. "Your city is very high above sea level," he wheezed, "and my lungs are spent. Let us finish this reading post." Lars gave a hacking cough. "Haste!" "Well," Gunnar said as he straightened, "we acknowledge your journey and have prepared a place for you to stay the rest of summer. It does take a day or two to acclimate. We'll complete the ceremony and get you to the quarters prepared for you in—" "You misunderstand, priest." The little man peered up questioningly at Gunnar, his bushy gray eyebrow quirked. "Gunnar," Gunnar said. "Priest Gunnar. Wait a moment. You were the one who sent me the missives that I delay my journey." "Well, yes, but—" "You think me a wisp of a man, is that it? Unable to travel as someone as young and strapping as yourself?" The high priest poked Gunnar in the stomach, and Gunnar straightened with shock. "Well, here I am," he coughed curtly, "spry as ever, and though I may have arrived unscathed, my shoes have withered. It feels as though I have only a piece of parchment between me and this floor." He poked a slippered foot out from under his brown robes. "But I have no need to tarry. A new pair of shoes, a hot bath, one night's rest, then I should be on my way." Gunnar's eyes darted to the people, their expressions ranging from shock to curiosity as they waited in quiet expectation. "Well, we expected you to stay for at least a month. However, if you are set on leaving, we do make the finest goat-hair slippers here in Enderin." Gunnar peeked over the priest's hat to find Rodna, the cobbler, who nodded in understanding. "And though we don't much partake in hot baths here, High Priest Lars, may I offer you cleansing accommodations at Celestial's pool instead? The water is cool and "No!" the High Priest interrupted without looking at Gunnar. "You may not. Now," the man cleared his throat, "you have a prophecy, boy? Share it, before my lungs give out." Bardock's expression held an array of emotions, and Gunnar prayed he would keep to the plan. "Yes, High Priest Lars." Bardock opened the scroll. Breathing a sigh of relief, Gunnar stepped back, allowing Bardock the stage. "On summer's turn, the year of the Hjorter, a death foretold will be put off by a sacrifice made. At the base of the holy mount, one of each household must sacrifice the idol they cling to, relinquishing it back to the earth, to save the one foretold to perish." Bardock grinned. Gunnar shook his head, pulling the smile from the boy's face. It was the second time Gunnar had falsified a prophecy, and this one incurred even more dread than the last. He scanned the people, watching for their reactions, before his eyes came to rest on the little man in the tall hat. Lars stared at Bardock, his eyes narrow. "That's your prophecy?" Panic flashed across Bardock's face before he regained a measure of composure. "Yes," he said, straightening his shoulders. "Yes, it is." With great effort, the little man stepped forward. He snatched the scroll from Bardoc's hands and eyed it greedily. He mumbled as he read before lowering it with a sniff. "Well, this is quite clear to me." A cavernous hole of fear gaped in Gunner's stomach, his eyes widening. "While I thank you, High Priest Lars, there's truly no need to interpret it." Gunner reached for the scroll. "I have been the priest of Temple Rin for several years." "It's clear," High Priest Lars began, as if Gunner hadn't said a word, "that I am to collect the most precious item from each household and discard them into the very fires of the earth." Bardock and Gunner exchanged a look. The former held confusion, the latter panic. Gunner's plans, like his confidence, shriveled like a grape left in the sun. What the high priest said would be taken as absolute truth. "Well," Gunner glanced at the people who had begun to talk amongst themselves. "People of Enderin, let us head home and collect our offerings, one item of worth to hand over to the high priest." "And quickly now, with that bath." Priest Lars passed the scroll back to Bardock. "I will be leaving early tomorrow." "You're sure you don't want to stay?" But the priest turned on a slippered foot, hobbled down the steps, and waved a hand at Gunner as if to shoo him away. "If this prophecy is as it is written, then I must rid the people of their idols. Now, where is that cobbler?" The people formed a line behind Lars as he exited the temple, whispering amongst themselves. "It's a good thing, isn't it?" Bardock caught Gunner's gaze. "That he's leaving so soon? Less of a chance he'll die here in Enderin." Gunner sighed at the boy's irreverence, but nodded all the same. "The previous prophecy stated the Holy One would die at the Holy Mountain. The sooner he leaves, the safer he'll be." The priest and novice secluded themselves in Gunner's cottage for the remainder of the day. Gunner had no desire to see his people flinging their best clothes, jewelry, and livestock at the little man in robes. But if it saved a life? He shook his head and sipped his tea. He had planned his interpretation pointedly, symbolically. The idols of people were not the objects they owned, but resident possessions of the heart. He would have requested each family put charcoal to parchment, writing the inner darknesses to which they clung, pride, lust, greed, and bury it in the ground. He sighed to himself. What did it matter? It was all a farce anyway. A banging on the door woke Gunner from a restless sleep. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. The sticky air signaled he had slept later than intended. The pounding continued, a foreboding thump, thump, thump that struck fear into his heart. He had meant to check on the high priest before morning. Perhaps the people were here to notify Gunner of his death. Fear clutched at his heart as he wrapped a robe tightly about himself. Thump, thump, thump. Bardock was curled up on a mat on the floor, one arm over his eyes, the other wrapping around Torny, who blinked blearily in the morning sun shining in from a window. "Traitor," Gunner whispered to the lizard. Gunner's hand hesitated as it moved to open the door. The entire plan would fall to pieces if Lars had died. The people would question. Thump, thump, thump. Would they revoke his right as priest? Would they refuse any further prophecies? Gunner straightened his shoulders, cleared his throat, and opened the door. "Priest Gunner!" Tanol exclaimed. His herd bleated in chorus behind him. "We were worried for a moment you were the Holy One who had perished." Gunner's eyes widened as what appeared to be the entirety of Enderin stood behind the shepherd. "Tanol, the high priest, tell me, is he—" "Alive and well," Tanol finished with a toothy grin. "The serviceers are also accounted for." He motioned to the group of 3 gray-clad women to the right of his flock. One of them waved. "Is the boy okay?" Gunner swiveled. Bardock hadn't moved. "Doc!" No answer. Torny, bite him. Torny obeyed. Ah! The boy jumped up, clad only in underclothes. He scuttled away from the iguana, who chirped happily. He's fine, Gunnar said, turning back to the shepherd. Where is the high priest? But Tanol had turned from him, his shepherd's crook raised high in the air, bells tinkling to herald his pronouncement. They are alive! The prophecy has been revoked! We did it! Let us bid High Priest Lars farewell! A roar came from the crowd, and Tanol's goats began to scatter. Gunnar shut his door, the grip of anxiety still clutching at his heart. The priest wasn't gone. Yet. There was still time. Get dressed, he told Bardock. Your lizard bit me! He's sorry. I'm sorry. Gunnar rushed to his rooms to change his own clothing. We're all sorry. The heat of the day was already upon them as Gunnar and Bardock left the cottage. The crowd had left, presumably offering their goodbyes to the high priest. Goats frolicked about the green hills, chased by children, escaping their greedy hands by climbing atop boulders. Tanol was nowhere to be seen. Torny rasped and licked Gunnar's neck as the priest and Bardock wound their way up the road to the main courtyard. I'm sorry, no time for tea, he said. We just need to keep our story straight and we'll be okay. Yes, I know, Bardock said with a nod. I'll keep my mouth shut. I was speaking to Torny. Bardock eyed the man beside him, brow contorted with concern. You're a strange man, Gunnar. Torny chirped. The duo had no need to enter the city proper, as they spotted a crowd of people around the southern gate of Enderin. In the center of the mass sat High Priest Lars atop a wagon, a goat hooked to the front of it. Gunnar's mouth dropped open. High Priest Lars, who had been small before, now looked minuscule against the mountain of possessions given up by the people of Enderin. Scrolls, furniture, bottles, clay pots, animals in cages, and food of every kind weighed down the wooden cart. Tanol whispered to the goat attached to the front, stroking its nose. Gunnar approached him, sliding his arms into his sleeves, guilt twisting in his gut. Tanol, don't tell me you're giving up Edda. Yes, Tanol said with a sniff. He needed something to pull his cart, and when he found out I hadn't offered up Edda right away, he told me it was my duty to the Celestials to hand her over. Oh, Tanol. Rage lit along the edges of Gunnar's mind. The high priest was never supposed to interpret that prophecy, but the act had been plucked from Gunnar's hands, and now... The young scribe at his side must have seen Gunnar's anger. He placed a hand on his arm. Gunnar took a steadying breath, eyes on Tanol. I'm so sorry, but we all must do what we must. The words crept past his lips, every one of them a lie. Gunnar turned to his novice, passing Torny into his arms, best to keep the lizard from Lars's roving eye. Gunnar surveyed the scene, knowing a life was still potentially at stake, in spite of how much it pained him to see his people having given their most prized possessions to a little man stuffed with his own position. He would take no pleasure in the high priest coming to harm. The wobbling high priest, shadowed beneath the mountain of goods, gave a hacking cough from atop his pedestal. Regret simmered deep in Gunnar as he realized he would not stop this. He couldn't. Priest Gunnar! The wheezing voice came from the driver's seat. Gunnar looked up, eyes squinting against the sun. My bath was too hot, and my shoes are too tight. Gunnar ground his teeth. Perhaps he had tried a little too hard to keep the man safe. Indeed, High Priest Lars, perhaps on your next visit you can enjoy the Celestials' pool, as I suggested before, and the shoes will stretch to your foot in time. The high priest coughed wetly. A full month here, by the stars above. A day was long enough. Dipping his head, Gunnar extended an arm outward to the south, as if releasing the tiny man from his obligations. Farewell, people of Enderin, The high priest waved over his shoulder as Edda the goat began her slow descent away from the rock-bordered city high on a hill. A tinkle of bells rang behind Gunnar, and Tenol's wavering voice broke Gunnar's thoughts. "Well," he said with a sniff, "we did it." "Maybe," Bardock said from Gunnar's other side. Gunnar turned to catch Bardock's eye, and his stern expression turned to a chuckle. Tenol wasn't paying them any mind. Together, they watched the cart trundle behind a boulder and disappear into the distance. It was the very last day of summer's turn, when High Priest Lars found himself braving Hekla. After almost a month of travel with a very moody goat, High Priest Lars was relieved to finally arrive at the smoking mountain. But he would not complain, for he was a man of the cloth, and men of the cloth did what needed doing. A trip up Mount Hekla was never his favorite thing to do, and he could have inquired of the novices to do it for him, but where was the sacrifice in that? This was a test, a bettering of himself as a man, as a priest, and afterward he would take a nice, hot bath, which were easy to come by in this part of the land. The path he was traveling narrowed, and High Priest Lars could no longer rest his slippered feet upon the buckboard of his wagon. He would have to lead the goat the rest of the way. No matter. He had already stopped by his own house before scaling the mountain. A quick stop, a lighter load. The priest had squirreled away the best and most tempting offerings for himself. He hummed as he stowed the remaining goods into the leather saddlebags resting on each side of the goat's rotund belly. He unlatched his paltry steed from the wagon and continued on, pulling the goat by its lead. His old knees ached, and his feet slipped in his newly made goat-hide slippers. His mind cursed the ground below, though his lips would not utter such ugly iterations. The goat began to bleat and disagree with their ascent the closer they got to the peak. Priest Lars didn't blame the thing. His lungs complained much the same. "Come on," he said as he yanked the lead. "Just a bit farther. I need to throw something in there." Rocky crags and trickling smoke were all that crowned Mount Hekla beneath the full moon. Peering over the edge and into the great red hole, he wobbled back onto his heels and took a steadying breath. Glancing back at the goat, laden with the prized possessions of the people of Enderin, he paused a moment as he thought of the priest. What was his name? Priest Gunnar. The man had tried to keep Lars from his visit, always a sign that rebellion had taken root when idolatry had become prevalent. It had only encouraged him faster to that high and horrible city. He had known another prophecy was coming, of course. The prophecy from a decade previous had predicted it. Perhaps, he mused, that was precisely what Priest Gunnar had been scared to tell him, why the priest of Enderin hadn't wanted him to come. Gunnar had assumed the death spoken of in the prophecy 10 years ago spoke of Lars himself. High Priest Lars chuckled at the thought. If they had just paid attention, they would have known the resolution to the prophecy had been in the lack of the next. He had known, of course, that whatever the boy novice had read that afternoon at Temple Ryn would be a farce. At the height of summer, year of the Hjorter, a holy one will perish at the holy mountain, the prophecy had read over a decade ago. The seers remained the only true holy men of their time. Lars was the high priest, yes, but he had never been holy. He could admit that much to himself. And Lars had always had a penchant for beautiful things. It seemed a waste, really, when the opportunity was so conveniently presented to him. The goat was at the end of its lead, head and neck stiff against the straight line of rope that led back to Lars's hand. He tugged, and the goat bleated, so he tugged again. Sweat, which had already dried against his lower back, began snaking down his spine once more. Screwing up his face, he pulled harder. "Come on, you scur!" The goat bleated at him. "Or I'll chuck you into the mountain too!" The lead suddenly slackened, and Lars's eyes widened as his new slippers shifted beneath him. The goat charged, head down, horns curled and at the ready, Lars attempted to run, but his slippers refused to gain traction against the smooth rock, and all he could do was turn away toward the gaping maw of the mountain. Lars had no screams as the goat butted him. He tumbled into the dark cavern that led to the red pool beneath, the goat's lead flipping away from his fingers. Only one word escaped his lips, one he hadn't dared utter in all his years as high priest. But Edda bleated, and no one heard it. It was the very last evening of summer's turn when Gunnar and Bardock shared a pot of tea at the base of Mount Enderin. With only the sounds of a crackling fire and a ruffling breeze, the two huddled together and sipped their tea. Cricket song was their only sonata before Gunnar cleared his throat. "Well," he said to the young novice, sitting across from him, "we made it." "There's still time, isn't there?" Bardock's eyes were on the stars, his fingers tapping on his bouncing knees. "Relax, Doc," Gunnar soothed. "All will be—" A knock on the wooden gate drew their eyes north and then to each other. They hadn't heard anyone come down the mountain. "I knew it," Bardock whispered, pulling Torny into his lap and holding him close. Torny hissed. Gunnar shook his head, finger to his lips, and stood. Approaching the gate, he unlatched it, and with his heart pounding so loud he thought Bardock could hear it, he swung the gate open. A boy stood on the other side, dressed in the common tunic of a scribe. He couldn't have been more than 10. He held out a shaking hand, a scroll squeezed between trembling fingers. Without much thought for decorum or tradition, Gunnar pried the proffered scroll from the boy and unrolled it beneath the light of the full moon. At summer's turn, year of the Hjorter, a death foretold will either be fulfilled with earth's fire— Gunnar took a gulp of air— or put off with its cooling waters, a dip in the pool of the celestials, a future restored. Mind whirling, Gunnar's gaze rested on the boy before him, mouth open to speak, but the earth itself answered, a rumble, a shake deep in the ground. It burrowed into Gunnar's bones. He whipped his head around to see Bardock scrambling to his feet with a screech, Torny's gray-green body flopping to the ground. The lizard skittered away. "Sir!" The new scribe crouched on the ground, hands covering his head. "What's happening?" A flash of color bloomed in the corner of the priest's eye. He turned his gaze west to see a cloud of red, a column of quick fire, and then all went dark once more. The moon hung low, blue-hued and silent. The breeze ceased its winding. All was still in Mothmar, the entire country holding a collective breath. Then slowly, the crickets returned in a staccato before ascending to a symphony, as if the quake had been part of the song. "Hello," Gunnar nodded to the boy with a steadying breath. "I'm Priest Gunnar of Temple Rin. What's your name?"
I hope you enjoyed listening to Of Prophecies and Pools by Amanda Auler, narrated by Paeter Frandsen of Christian Geek Central. If you want to read more by Amanda, go to her website at authoramandaauler.com to find signed copies of her books as well as audiobooks. While you're there, I recommend signing up for her newsletter to get a copy of this story, because it also includes the first chapter of the Mothmar trilogy, which actually highlights Gunnar's childhood experience as a scribe to a seer. It made me so eager to read the rest of the series. If you enjoyed listening to Paeter narrate the story, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com, or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. And if you enjoy listening to the Finding Fantasy Reads podcast, I think there's a good chance you'll enjoy listening to my audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars. You can find it on all the same podcasting platforms under Blood of the Stars, or you can listen on my website at corinnenorton.com/audio. As always, I will have links for all those sites in the show notes. Thank you all for listening, and happy reading.